I guess that's already recording, so there's 10 seconds of blather. We left off talking about Constantine for the midterm, and we were talking about this major event that happened under his watch, if you will, under his reign, where he converted to Christianity in the year 312. He had a vision before marching into battle against his enemy Maxentius in the Civil War to control Rome. This was the aftermath of the Tetrarchy experiment by Constantine's grandfather, Diocletian. And by adopting the Christian symbol, which was probably the name of Christ in Greek, Constantine attributed the victory in the battle at the Milvian Bridge to the intervention of the Christian God. And from that point forward, Christianity becomes increasingly associated with the Roman Empire. Okay? The Roman Empire morphs into, really in many ways, morphs into the Roman Church. Milvian, M-I-L-V-I-A-N. The Milvian Bridge. It's a bridge across the Tiber just outside of Rome. Okay? So in 312, he issues the Edict of Tolerance from his capital city in Milan. Remember that each of the 4 members of the Tetrarchy had capitals in different cities scattered around the empire. Constantine was in Milan, and he issues the Edict of Tolerance, the Edict of Milan in 312, saying that the empire will no longer persecute Christians. The Edict of Tolerance. And it basically says that they will not persecute anybody for their religious beliefs. Right? So it's not just focused entirely on Christians, it's the tolerance of all religions. Then, 13 years later, because it takes them a while to get through the rest of the Civil War issue, it's not over with the battle of the Milvian Bridge. But still, in 325, there's a second edict issue that makes Christianity the official religion of the empire. At the same time, this does not contradict the Edict of Tolerance. They will still tolerate others, but Christianity is considered to be the official religion of empire. Correct? This happens in 325. Okay? So this is really a major turning point in European history, particularly the history of ancient Rome, because we move to what many historians call the early Christian period. A better term is probably late antique, because not everybody was Christian, right? They're tolerant of alternative religions as well. But in many ways, this conversion by Constantine begins to signal the downfall of the old Roman Empire. Because in addition to adopting Christianity, we'll talk about this more next week, one of the other things that Constantine did was to move the capital of the empire out of the city of Rome. Now, the steps toward that had already taken place with the Tetrarchy. But Constantine established a new capital for the entire empire in an old Greek city in modern-day Turkey. The city was called Byzantium. To the Greeks, Constantine renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And eventually, 1454, it was overrun by the Turks, and Constantinople became Istanbul, which is more or less, by the 1920s, became Istanbul, which is, many people think the Turkish pronunciation of Constantinople, Istanbul, Constantinople. Okay? We'll talk more about Constantinople next week. Okay? This is a huge moment in European history. There are very few that are very important. When we were looking at his Colossus at the end of class last week, we were talking about the fact that this massive sculpture that had once been 30 feet over your head seems to look to the heavens for guidance, and emphasizes his eyes. They're disproportionately large, and that is a way of showing, in fact, I think trying to amplify his soul. You'll also notice that the sort of perfection of youth that we saw in a great many Roman emperors, the perfection, the sort of Greek perfection of the physiognomy of the facial features. Here is a little bit less of a hook nose, sort of a short forehead, there's a movement away from the Greek ideal physical form. Already beginning in the 3rd century, the 200s, and becomes the preferred style under Constantine, which we'll talk about. So, there's where he was. You remember he was in the Basilica of Constantine. It was actually begun by Maxentius, his enemy, and completed under Constantine after he defeated Maxentius. And this became his presence in Rome because Constantine was so very rarely there, and placed in the apse of the Basilica as his surrogate, as his stand. Yeah, Mary. I know you did. That's why you had your moment.
So, I know that you told us that they're looking at this time for guidance. So why is one eye like a moon and then the other one looks like a star?
Because one's damaged and the other one isn't. Right. This one here is damaged. It's been chipped away a bit. Because you'll notice the head's no longer sitting on the body. And I would imagine that when it fell 30 feet, something happened to it. But that's not intentional. It would have originally looked like this. It's just been damaged. Okay, so it's not like a moon of the stars, like a Cat Stevens song from the early 70s. Yeah. Jack. First, the idea of the Roman Empire falling is kind of a myth. It's not like the Roman Empire just fell. However, because Constantine had moved the capital of Rome to Constantinople, this meant that he took with him a significant amount of the Roman legion, the army, right? And that meant that the city of Rome was more open to attack, right? And in fact, the very first time it is attacked is 410, about 100 years later, right? Sacked for the first time in 1,000 years, and the second time in 527. I think the second one was by the Vandals, which is why we use the term vandalism. Right? Going back to the question, when was the body, right, melted down or reused or whatever? I can't answer that exactly. The only thing but the bits and the fragments were obviously found in excavations around Rome. This is why this statue to this day sits in the museum of Rome. It came from there. It never moved left. As to exactly what was destroyed. Sometime after this vacuum of power, that Constantine Rome started. Yeah. That people in Rome complained about for the next couple hundred years. Hey, you guys were so giveaways about us. Now Constantine, remember, had been the son of Constantine Chlorus, and eventually inherited the Empire of the East. Began to adopt Greek as his form of language. This is why the name of Christ was in Greek letters, that's XP, right? Whereas the people in the West spoke Latin. And this also added to the sense of dissociation of having been abandoned by old Rome, the Roman leadership. But it's important to remember that Constantine and his followers still look at themselves as being Roman emperors, even though they're not as Roman anymore. Right? They are emperors of the empire. So even though we've transferred power to a certain degree with Constantine to this new city in the East, our emperors see themselves as the inheritors of that great legacy. Right? So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer than that. That's my walk away. Okay. In 312, or shortly thereafter, the Roman Senate voted to erect a triumphal arch to commemorate Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge. We've seen triumphal arches before. There was one of those 10-minute art pieces that talks about the Arch of Titus, right? Meant to commemorate his victory over the people of modern-day Israel, the people of Palestine, the Jews, the Jewish wars. Well, this was to commemorate now the victory of Constantine over his enemy Maxentius. A bit of local resonance here. The Arch of Constantine was one of 2 or 3 different Roman prototypes that the architect Daniel Burnham looked to when he built Union Station downtown. And you can see that all he's basically done is taken the side arches and made them the same height and got rid of all of the statues of emperors and whatnot. But we still have our Roman guard standing guard at the top of the attic level, right? These are nice little things to remember, that a lot of what we have around here is taken away in order to find a sort of monumental gateway to the city. He thought about a monumental gateway, right? And this made as good sense as anything, especially because people look back on Constantine a bit more favorably than some of the other Roman emperors, partly because of his religion, right? Now, the vast machine on both sides, the temperatures on both sides. Yeah.
Do you know if you talked about the Arch?
Not off the top of my head. I can't remember. Probably something along the lines of to Constantine who has defeated his enemy Maxentius, by order of the Senate. That's the sort of the standard for these things, right? What's interesting about the Arch of Constantine is that the vast majority of sculptures on it were taken from other triumphal monuments, and this was fairly common. Somebody asked me in my class, why did Vespasian recarve Nero into his own features? This is a fairly common thing to do, was to take the monuments of your predecessors and turn them into your own. And so for the Arch of Constantine, what they did was they went and lifted. Remember that the Romans were building in concrete, and they would just put revetments on the outside, right, to cover up that core. And so these are revetments as well, and very easy to move. And the ones that are marked in yellow came from one triumphal arch, the reddish ones from another, the blue ones from yet another. Okay, all of that was what we call spolia. Think about spoils, right? The spoils of war. Spolia is the Latin word for that. And it describes any kind of thing that's been mixed from one monument to another. And what he ended up doing was recarving, or he, the Senate, recarved the faces of the old emperors, so they now look like Constantine. That's not all they did to it as they moved them here. And everybody in Rome would have recognized that, right? And all of a sudden it's just missing from another monument, and here it, oh, that's where it went. Nobody's seen it all, scaffolding and whatnot. And it's important to remember that the Senate would have known that as well, that there's no way to pull a fast one here, right? They're doing this with a purpose. And again, there was a tradition for doing that. And what's interesting with the spolia that was taken from other triumphal monuments is that they were very selective. They only took bits from the emperors who were looked at as having been good emperors, right? So there's no Trajan Deciuses, there's no Diocletians, there's no Neros or anything like that going on here. They come from Emperor Hadrian, and they come from Marcus Aurelius, the people who were looked at as being really, really good emperors of the past. And mostly from the 2nd century, right, over 100 years earlier, now early 4th century. So they're bypassing those problematic years of the 200s, where we saw a lot of violence, a lot of overthrows rather than smooth transitions of government. He's looking back to a better path, right? Or at least that's the message that the Arch is given. That Constantine, with his victory, will return Rome to a lost glory day over 100 years earlier. Now, the only bits of this that are actually, go ahead. That's the Colosseum. Yeah. Yes. And so usually there's one hell of a line floating around this thing, right? Because everybody's going to the Forum that's just over here. The Arch of Titus is just up this hill over here, right? They come around this way, the exit's out there, and then the tour guide starts nailing it. Right? There's a waiting line to go to the Colosseum. And it used to be, when I first went here, way too long, 30 years, there was section looks good right now. So the form is just this way. Okay? And that's where the archetype is found. These parts are all borrowed from other monuments. What's original, of course, is the actual arch itself. And sculpture-wise, these bits. The frieze that runs over the top of the side arches is the primary bit of new sculpture that was placed here on the Arch of Constantine. And you'll notice that it's decorated similarly front and back, and even on the sides. One side, I think it's just one on the left here, shows you the battle at the Milvian Bridge. Very difficult to make out. I spent some time looking for Constantine to figure out where he was. So you see it's pretty badly damaged, but at the same time you can make out the water down below, and you can see that we have our men on horseback up above, the defeated enemy laying underneath them, kind of like what we saw in that battle sarcophagus that was in one of the 10-minute art fixes, right? But there are soldiers standing on either bank of the river, and there's the battle, right? So this is the battle that it commemorates, and both of the friezes on this side are in fact dedicated to battles that led to bringing again the peace to Rome, the peace back to Rome. And if we go around the other side, what we have is the benefits of the peace. Sound familiar? Kind of like the Areopagus, right? Only there we have the foundation of Rome on one side, and then the benefits of the peace of Rome on the opposite side. So here, on the opposite side of the Arch of Constantine, we have images where after the war has been settled, Constantine is redistributing the spoils of war. Right? The term for this, the swanky term that you may not know, is largesse. Right? That's the spoils of war being given back to the people. So they were able to raise quite a bit of money, right? Things that are valuable from the defeated armies, and rather than just keeping it for Constantine and his circle, he redistributes it to the people, giving them something back, right? Showing that, in fact, he cares for them, right? So this is the prosperity that his victory has brought to all Romans. And the message of the archway is that it benefits everyone, not just Constantine's armies. I have a detail of that, and I think your text just gives you this detail in the center of it. Here, Constantine is in the middle. He's missing his head. Going back to Jacqueline's question, right? Once Rome, especially the vestiges of ancient Rome, are under question insofar as their validity, their necessity, their value. One of the things we often see for people who look at works of art is they will try to destroy the head, and so it's missing. Yeah, but that's him in the middle, seated on the throne, and you'll notice that this is the artist's way of elevating him in status. Right? He's taller than anyone around him. You'll also notice that were he to stand up, he's taller than the people in the front row. And in fact, the people in the back row do seem taller. So this idea that when you go back in space you get bigger is, I think, intended to show status. Right? It's our old hieratic scale that we saw back in some of our very earliest works of art. So here he is in the middle. Everyone's looking to him and giving him honor. The 6 figures in the foreground and the people behind them are all raising their hands to praise him for his actions. All of his immediate court around him are looking to him for guidance. Right? It would be very easy, even without the head, that it's easy to tell where he is while this. You'll also notice that almost everyone is dressed similarly. They all have this toga on with a diagonal sash, kind of like a Miss America pageant, right? Across. Miss Oregon. Miss Missouri, Mr. Constantine, in the center. And this is the imperial robe. And it's worn not only by Constantine, but by members of his court. And originally it would have been probably purple with a gold sash, or vice versa, right? Is the norm, and then the rest of his court would wear something white with a purple sash, right? to show their allegiance to the course itself. And we'll see this in other images probably next week. But they're moving in from the side. You can see here that's cut off by the archway there. But you can see his hand coming in from the side too. Right? I wanted to compare this to the Areopagus to talk a bit again about anti-classicism, something we mentioned a week ago before the midterm. This movement away from that sort of perfected, idealized celebration of physical form that had been sort of the high point of the development of Greek art sculpture and then adopted by the Romans. If we think about the trajectory of Greek art as we trace it in class, we saw it up to the classical period, right, becoming increasingly realistic, increasingly physical. And I think that even continues into the Hellenistic period, that idea that the here and now is that kind of important, you know? And the Romans pick this up, add into it some Etruscan details, but they certainly do borrow this Greek idea that the human form, right, is beautiful beyond compare. That it's been perfected to the point where it doesn't even really look like people really look. Whether it's a 70-year-old Augustus or anyone for that matter, the spear bearer, right? No one looks that good. It's a perfected physical form. And what we see happening in the Arch of Constantine and in other works from the late 3rd and early 4th centuries is we see that they have abandoned that style. Look at how stumpy the figures are. Look at how redundant and repetitive the poses are, as opposed to the variance of ages and poses that we have with the Areopagus. Look at how stiff and uncomfortable the movement back into space is, with this low release head here. Here it works really well, and in fact they diminish in size even as they move back into space. And we saw a number of Roman sculpture with classical tendencies to sort of be really illusionistic, really realistic. And there's something unrealistic about the sculptures for Constantine. They're turning their backs on that style. And this had been really the dominant style under Constantine, but had begun already with the Tetrarch, where we have the same sort of stumpy figural style, without the easy grace and perfection of the contrapposto pose. Standing rather flat-footed and stiff. And again, redundant, repetitive, not lively like we've become used to with so much Roman art. So what brings about this anti-classical style? And this has been a matter of much discussion. Early on, art historians said, oh, well, they had to put this up quickly. So they had to do it fast, and therefore it sucks. Right? Anti-classicism is not as good. But that's kind of dumb, because really every monument is put up equal. It's not put up any more fast than any other one. Right? So that doesn't really hold too much water. It also is based on the idea that somehow art should always be, and once art achieves a certain level of quality, a certain level of style, that it should stay there or get better based on some sort of idea of what better means. That should continue to move forward. But one of the things that the 20th century has taught us is that artistic styles are chosen for a particular reason. Think about modern art. One of the things we know from modern art is that Picasso didn't paint the way he painted because he couldn't paint. You may think that, but it's not true. He knew how to draw the human figure better than anybody in this world ever will. He chose to do what he did. Okay? When Jackson Pollock decided to drip paintings, it was after about 10 years of doing figurative art very well. He chose a non-representational style. And this has affected how we interpret this. The style is a choice. There were lots of different styles for Constantine's artists to choose from. Why did they choose this one? And many people think they chose this from the array of Roman styles available in the early 4th century because it fit their purposes. Earlier Roman art focused on the human, the physical, the body. This is moving away from that, just as Constantine is focusing more on spiritual ideas. That the notion of not relying on this, and from Constantine's point of view, this pagan idea of the human body being something that we should revel in. That's very antithetical to Christian ideas. Now, yes, in modern Christianity, this is that your body is a temple, go get fit, right? But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you should be, subscribing to Playboy. I guess we're a bad analogy. They don't do new photos anymore. Stop publishing new pictures themselves, right? You don't go around ogling, celebrating the perfect physical form in that way for its own sake. So a lot of people suggested that the anti-classicism we begin to see much more dominant under Constantine has everything to do with this new interest in trying to make an art that is, is itself physical, so it's three-dimensional, right? And at the same time make an art that tries to emphasize spiritual values. And the anti-classicism that we're seeing here with Constantine will become a sort of dominant trend for a lot of the Middle Ages, where art becomes much more two-dimensional when it's on the wall, none of that second or fourth style of Roman wall painting, where you get a strong physicality. You can see it in a flat, and they become nothing more than a series of symbols that direct us to ideas. Right? And part of that is because, why make it look like this world if you're focusing on the next one? That's the long and the short of it, right? Why make an art that replicates our world so perfectly when your major focus is not about this world, but instead about transcendental ideas? And that's exactly what Jackson Pollock said he was trying to do, not in a Christian vein, right? When he gave up representation, started doing drip paintings. He wanted them to point to something other than the world around you. When Kandinsky was claimed to have come up with the very first abstract painting, he said what he was doing was he was trying to focus on the spiritual art. And the only way he could do that was to stop painting things that looked like the world around you, that reminded you of the physical, the here and now. This has affected how we think of early Christian art. That it's focusing very, very much on a style of art that helps it to convey its messages. And one of those central messages is a greater concern with spiritual matters. Even when we're talking about faith, right? Even when we're talking about Constantine. Okay, now speaking of Constantine and spirituality, after adopting Christianity and winning the Civil War, right, defeating Maxentius and eventually Maxentius' successor, Constantine also decides to give something back. We've already seen him distributing the largesse on the Arch of Constantine, but he goes a step further. He needs to give something back to the Christians in particular, who had been so badly persecuted under his grandfather. Okay? And so what he does, in order to appease this new sector of society that he's trying to rally behind him, is he builds massive churches on all of the major holy sites. Places where Christians had already been gathering to worship. Constantine puts up a massive state-sponsored church. So they don't have to do it in the rain anymore. Do it in the out of doors. So the Church of St. Peter's in Rome, which was torn down in the 16th century, the one that's there now is a reconstruction. Because the Pope, can you imagine the Pope doing that now? In the 16th century, the Pope decided that it wasn't big enough. Sounds like Arlington County Building Code, doesn't it? Not big enough. You got this whole lot, why not fill the whole thing with a house? I'm mad that they tore down, right down the street here, around the one sort of between Old Dominion. There's a stone house, it looks like early 19th century, stone house. And it's gone. It's just, first they gutted it, looked like a land down, and then the next day I walked by, and it is just gone. Now, they even tried to save the stones. 19th century field stone. But not big enough. That's what the Pope said in the 16th century, not big enough, right? Tore down St. Peter's that had been constructed by Constantine over the grave of St. Peter, considered by Christians to be, Catholics to be the first Pope, right? A follower of Christ buried here in Rome. So, major holy sites receive these amazing buildings sponsored and paid for by the Roman Emperor who had just, within a couple generations, been persecuting them, right? He builds one here, St. Peter's. He builds another one over the grave of Christ in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He builds another one over the birthplace of Christ in Bethlehem, and on it goes, right? So major buildings as a way of giving something back to the people who are supporting them. Now, we'll talk more about these building sites in a 10-minute art fix that's coming up. I just want to kind of reiterate some of the big points. This is where the basilica moves from being a Roman state building to being a Christian temple. Constantine's builders used the old Roman basilica as the basis for the new Christian temple. And all of Constantine's buildings on these different sites were based on the basilica. This established a pattern that would be followed by later Christian churches through most of Western Europe. For Constantine, the reason he had his builders do this, the reason that they chose the form of the basilica, in a nutshell, is it became symbolic. This was sponsored by the emperor. Because emperors had built basilicas all along as state buildings. Now, it's a religious building. It became incredibly symbolic. You all remember back in the Roman Empire, you go to the basilica to conduct legal proceedings in the presence of the emperor. Well, here you're going to get communion in the presence of God, right? Same idea, right? Thus the same building. They had tweaked it a bit to make it work, but it's a basilica. So we had to determine early on that a Roman basilica was not a church. After St. Peter's, it is. Right? This is where we start to see it now become the Christian church. Now, I need to talk a little bit here about the idea of pilgrimage, and look at a couple of objects from the Dumbarton Oaks collection in doing that. Already by the 4th century, the practice of visiting Christian holy sites had become really widespread. This is part of the reason that Constantine builds a church on St. Peter's, because Christian pilgrims were coming here. A long-established practice of going to holy sites for spiritual benefit, right, to pray. Now, exactly how that all parses out is another thing, but certainly I think it has everything to do with the old Roman idea that legal proceedings had to take place in the presence of the emperor. That if you go to a holy site, you are really kind of in the presence, in a very different way. So it became really kind of common practice among those who could afford it, and it wasn't cheap. You have to take like a year off to live in Northern Europe to do this, you know. Visit the holy sites. Go to the grave of St. Peter. Go to Christ's grave in Jerusalem. Right? Maybe do both, a big old round trip. Yeah? It's not that different from the tourist trade, really. You know? And there were people that were there even then to show you around, give you something in return. Not selling you selfie sticks, but they sell you a little ampule full of holy oil that you can bring back with you. And that's what the thing on the left was. The 6th century pilgrim ampule, a little metal vial, right? Would have originally had a little thin jar-like stopper thing on the top, right? And it would be filled with holy oil from one of the sites that the pilgrim had visited. In this case, probably from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Holy Sepulchre, the grave of Christ, the holy grave, right? And in fact, what we see here is an image on it showing Easter Sunday morning, where three women named Mary Magdalene, and two others, come to the grave of Christ on Easter Sunday morning. Does anyone know what happens there? And then Easter Sunday, three Marys arrive. What happens next? Right, Jesus isn't there, but who is? An angel, exactly. An angel tells them he's not here. He is risen. Go tell the other guys, right? And by the way, this is nice because women get the message first, right? And so, the apostles are all back there crying, And Mary Magdalene will be the one that leads them back and tells the apostles he's risen. At which point they go and see it. So the very first people to witness now the empty grave of Christ is Mary Magdalene and these two other women named Mary. The three Marys. Now, we only see two of the three on the left. But they're coming now to the grave. They're bringing incense in their hands. And on the right, we see the angel seated on the stone that's been rolled away. And is pointing to the tomb saying, "He ain't here." Right? And what we see in the center is the way that the Holy Sepulchre looked in the 6th century, by which time it had been decorated for pilgrims to see. And it remains to this day decorated. If you go see the Holy Sepulchre, I got to go when I was 21. You see this big marble structure that has been accreted through the years by various decorations that have been added to it, right? It's not like you're going to go see a empty human hole in the ground, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing here, is the way that it looks when that pilgrim bought it. So you can imagine this as being sort of like a postcard, it's like 6th, 7th century postcard of the holy site. But at the same time, you can imagine the person who owns this now could imagine themselves being like the Marys. They've gone and they've seen the empty tomb. Right? They've come back with this memento that reminds them that the tomb is empty. That the angel is telling them, just as he told the Marys, that Christ isn't here. For us, it remains this really important example locally that this pilgrimage industry was really strong. And we can trace it back even before the building of St. Peter's. Right? He's addressing a need that the Christians had for a place to worship at these holy sites they were coming to. Dunbar Notes has another nice object from the same time period. It's a glass chalice, probably also a pilgrim's trinket. And it shows a couple of pilgrims worshiping. I'm sorry, it's broken. It's not my fault. Sorry. A couple of pilgrims worshiping a cross that's placed inside of a shrine that you can see here on the right. On visiting Jerusalem, Rome, pilgrims would not just go to one site. Right? They wouldn't just go to Rome and go to the grave of St. Peter's. You'd go see everything. Right? You'd go find out. One of the churches had the rag that St. Veronica wiped the face of Christ with when he was carrying the cross, and was miraculously imprinted with the face of Christ. That was in one of the churches in Rome. You go there too, right? If you went to Jerusalem, you would go to the tomb, but you go to other places as well, right? To sort of follow in the footsteps of Christ as a sort of religious duty, if you will, right? Or potential spiritual benefit. Well, many of these sites were determined during the time of Constantine. His mother, who was eventually canonized, St. Helena, had spent time in Jerusalem going around and doing some, I don't want to be disrespectful, amateur archaeology, right? Looking for the holy sites, determining where they were. And one of the things that St. Helena discovered was the cross on which Christ was crucified. And the legend says that it's a horrible legend, really, because she finds out that there's this Jewish, this legend came up in the Middle Ages when they hated Jews, right? A lot of anti-Semitism. And they basically, the legend is that St. Helena hears that this Jew knows where the real cross is, and he won't tell anybody, so she tortures him. She sticks him in a well until he fesses up. Primitive waterboarding, right? Water holing. Sticks him in a well until he fesses. So as they go dig it up, and lo and behold, they find the cross. So they also find the other two crosses, the ones that the thieves were crucified on next to Christ. So who's to know, right? You got three now. How are you supposed to tell? And the legend says that at the moment this happened, a funeral procession went by. And so what they did was they held out the three crosses as the funeral passed underneath them. And when the funeral procession went under the true cross, the man was miraculously resurrected. And that's how it proved the true cross, right? Now, believe it or not, that was the medieval legend, okay? What happened was then, of course, the true cross became a place where pilgrims would go. This is already in the 4th century. So now by the 6th, 7th century, pilgrims are going to see the cross that Helena had found. And it had been encrusted with gems and precious stones. And became, so people would give gifts to it, right? And they would attach them to it in order to embellish it as a sign of their own devotion. And so there's this gem-encrusted cross that was placed on the site where Christ was supposedly crucified. This became another place that we would visit. And our chalice over here shows people worshiping, adoring the cross, right? And that relates to this practice of actually going to the site of the crucifixion and now worshiping the cross. And it's also a sign that the idea of the XP has now been replaced with this T-shaped cross that we're much more familiar with from all of our classrooms. Yeah. I have another view of it? I don't. So, we're seeing now Christianity on the rise everywhere in the old Roman Empire, and the importance of this not only for what Constantine does, but what immediately happens afterwards. As Christianity was recognized by this edict from Constantine, or these edicts from Constantine, later Romans, the wealthier ones, began to adopt it in greater numbers. And the wealthier ones not only adopted it, but added it to their very spectacular sarcophagi. We looked at carved sarcophagi before the midterm in one of the 10-minute part sixes. Remember that those sarcophagi, plural sarcophagi, those elaborately carved coffins would have been the sole province of the wealthiest, of the wealthy. And Junius Bassus was the prefect of Rome, a local leader in Rome. Not unlike a mayor, I think, in many ways. But he's certainly of the class that could afford an elaborately carved sarcophagus, like this one. And it's decorated with Christian themes. He's one of these people who, remember, Constantine legalizes Christianity only in 312, or tolerates it, and then 325 it becomes this religion of empire. And so we're within 30 years of that, 35 years of that here, very early on. And he has moved from a sarcophagus that's covered with Roman mythology or with scenes from his own life, which is what we saw before, to being covered with scenes from the Christian stories. And there are 10 compartments, 8 different scenes, a couple of them stretch over 2 scenes, all of which come from the Bible. Some of them from the Old Testament, some of them from the New Testament. The Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the life of Christ, and the Acts of the Apostles. Right? So it's a melange of the two. Are there any scenes you can recognize right away that you don't need to take a college level class and say, oh, I recognize that scene? Yeah. The Garden of Eden, exactly. That's what almost everybody's able to get right here. Is in fact Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And you'll notice that they are there after the fall. They've noticed that they're naked all of a sudden. right? They weren't aware of it before. And they're covering themselves up with those massive fig leaves as they turn their heads away in shame. You'll notice that it originally had the serpent, but it's been broken off, right? Again, the damage that came to this. And by the way, this is in the crypt of St. Peter's, but there's a cast of it in one of the Vatican museums as well. We see other elements of the garden. We see on the sides, either side, there's a sheaf of wheat on Adam's side, and behind Eve, there's an animal with its head up. This is certainly a harbinger of Cain and Abel, who make grain and animal sacrifices and lead to sort of the outcome of the sin of man. But you notice how deeply carved it is, even though the figures have that sort of stumpy anti-classical style, right? They don't have the perfected bodies of ancient Greeks, but they are still quite well carved, even though the hands are a little on the oversized side. Right? Now, why are they here? When we looked at a Roman sarcophagi, we saw that many of the scenes seem to have been chosen either to commemorate the person who was there inside the sarcophagus, or Roman myths that related to the afterlife, particularly Bacchus, right? As the symbol of the afterlife. What's up with Adam and Eve? That's all about death, isn't it? But in many ways, it remains a reminder to us all of the need for salvation, the need for Christ. And a very poignant reminder that, hey, everyone has inherited this legacy. And certainly the scene with the wheat and the animal behind them is all about that inheritance. Because it is their sin that causes Cain to slay Abel. And those are the foretold by the two offerings behind it. Now, I'm not going to go through all 10 of these, but I will look at a few. In the center, we see Christ. At the bottom, this is his entry into Jerusalem. The last week of his life, he makes an entry into the city of Jerusalem, knowing full well that he's going there to die. He enters on the back of a donkey. People climb in trees to see him. You'll notice that Christ is beardless. Christ doesn't get a beard until later in Christian art. It's not until about the 6th century or so that we begin to see him beardless. And it's not like all of a sudden one day we wake up and Christ is wearing a beard, you know? Not like a steroid problem or something like that. But they run side by side. We'll talk a little bit more about why a little bit tonight and more next week about how Christ changes from the beardless Christ to the bearded Christ. Up above this, we see Christ in heaven, enthroned for all time, surrounded by Saints Peter and Paul. And again, you'll notice that he is beardless. Peter and Paul, on the sides, were seen as representatives of everyone that Christ converses. Peter was a Jew. Paul was a Gentile. Paul was a Roman. So they represent all people coming to Christ. Christ sits in the middle with them flanking him. Again, beardless. Where they're bearded, it makes them look more like philosophers, doesn't it? Great, you were pointing. The guy underneath his feet. Who is that? What is that? You don't know, right? There's a big bearded, muscular bearded guy down below. And you can see there's some attempt at that sort of Hellenistic musculature down there that Christ is standing directly on. We've seen this guy before. Do you remember where? Mark? No? Because he wouldn't be on top of God the Father, right? Sorry? That was a nice analogy. Here's what we saw him. This is the breastplate of Augustus Panaporta, where we saw the sky god up above Apollo as he's pulling himself across the sky. And you can see that this is borrowed on that. So it's really like he's standing right on the heads of the pagan gods. Right? And they're still using Roman themes to illustrate Christian ideas. He's supposed to be in heaven. How do you get that idea across? You use the old Roman idea of heaven. right? Because that's exactly what it is there. This also helps to explain why Christ is beardless in early images. Because Christ's images were based on images of the Roman emperor. And the most common Roman imperial image was beardless. Right? Was based on the image of the emperor. And the emperor's image, of course, was associated with Apollo, the sun god, right? So just as the emperors were seen in Roman times to have descended from the god, doesn't that make a nice analogy for Christ, who also descends from the god, becomes fully human, right? So early on we see that his image is in fact most closely associated with the emperor and Apollo. And that in fact many of the Christian traditions, when it comes to making art for the first time, they simply go back to good Roman prototypes and alter them for their own uses. But they're never haphazard. They're doing it really well, you know. They pick the right one as the analogy. Yeah? So we have Christ in the center. I'm going to show you only, I think, two more of these. The ones that appear around the side seem rather haphazard. There's no sort of sequencing here where you can say, okay, A, B, C, D. You don't read them like you would a comic strip, right? Left to right and top to bottom. In fact, there really is no narrative sequencing. Each one is a vignette that has been pulled out of its narrative surroundings. So it's not like this is the first scene that leads to the one next to it. What this one shows is a scene from the Old Testament. That's Father Abraham offering his son Isaac in sacrifice. Somebody must know this story as well. Yeah? Hit it, Emily.
And Abraham kind of reluctantly does it.
Right. Why did God ask him to do that, by the way? Do you remember that part of it? Right, exactly. You don't have to sacrifice a son. What does he do instead? A lamb, exactly. He says, the angel says, not only do you not have to do this, but if you just look over there in the bushes, the thicket, right? You'll find the lamb, you can use that one instead, right? So here's Abraham. He actually goes up with the servant. That's what we do here. The angel broke it off, right? There's the lamb, the thicket, there's little Isaac down below here, and there's the altar, right, with flames even on it, right? Bird offerings on the altar. There's our attempt at sculpting flames. Go ahead and try, right? Not so easy. Always ends up looking like scat. Anyway, Isaac is crumpled up. He's willing to do his father's work, and Abraham, knife in hand, right, ready to do the evil deed, if you will. But stopped at the last moment. His faith has been proven. Now, why is this here? We go back to this Roman tradition of illustrating sarcophagi with images that relate to mythologies that determine sort of death and resurrection, right? For medieval theologians, and we can really talk about that now, for theologians going back to the early stages of Christianity, one of the things that they did was to find parallels between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. The things that happened in the Old Testament, right, parallel, prophesy, right, reflect things that happen in the New Testament. And the term they use for this is typology. The Old Testament establishes a type that is followed by the New Testament. Think of art, well, we don't use typewriters anymore, right? We still call it typewriter keyboards. Right? Think back to the days of typewriters, right? The whole point is that you've got a matrix that is followed, right? It establishes the type, you know? So typology is this idea that events in the Old Testament establish the basic outlines of stories that prophesy what's going to happen to Christ in the New Testament. So the idea of the sacrifice of Isaac, a father sacrificing his only begotten son, only born son, right, as a test of faith and then miraculously at the last moment, the death is negated. This was seen by theologians as a strong metaphor for exactly what happened to Christ. He too, his Father, let this happen to him, right? God the Father let his only begotten Son be killed, but miraculously the death is negated, right? But not before it happened. So there's always some slight variance, it's not a direct parallel, but close enough that people would look at this and go, I know that relates to Christ. So Christ appears here, but more often than not, the images that are shown relate to Christ through this medieval idea of typology, which we're going to see an awful lot, where images from the Old Testament, the New Testament. Another of the images here in the lower right corner shows Daniel in the lion's den. And this is from it's the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, where Daniel was an advisor to King Nebuchadnezzar. He refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar's God and sort of showed up Nebuchadnezzar's prophets, his non-Jewish prophets, and he was punished for this. What Nebuchadnezzar did was he had this, it sounds like something out of a bad crime film. He had this pit where he starved lions, right? And kept it covered with this rock. And whenever he got displeased with them, some stories, he'd chuck them in there and they'd get eaten up, right? By the lions, and it'd be done. Do you ever see the Snatch, that movie with Brad Pitt? So some guy did it with pit bulls, right? So, starve the animals, feed them a particularly horrific death. So what happens is, of course, that they're going to take Daniel, chuck him in the lion's den, and lo and behold, they roll the stone over the top. And 3 days later, they're going to go back and find it, what's left, to make sure. And they roll the stone away, and after 3 days in the pit, right, Daniel's still alive. Right? He's been miraculously saved. The lions refuse to eat him. So again, this for Christian theologians, this is a parallel for Christ. He goes into the ground for 3 days. Certain death, and on the third day he is resurrected. The stone is rolled away and the body is there. So the images that are chosen here are all images that relate to this idea of resurrection, but also allow us to think about Christ without seeing him in every single thing. Right? And for anyone looking at something and understanding it that way, where you get it slowly and then it dawns on you, is much more memorable and much more valuable as an experience than being filled with heaven. Because you've had to suffer, right? You've had to suffer and think about it. And I spent a long time trying to figure out the sequence thing, and I can't figure out it. Right? It just doesn't work that way. Some of you are working on this over the Dunbar Notes. Listen, not everybody adopted Christianity right away, right? This is after Christianity became the official religion of empire, the Caesar sarcophagus of the Dunbar Notes. But we can see that it's still very much a Roman sarcophagus. And the images here are, again, mythological images meant to relate to death and the afterlife, death and resurrection. And what it illustrates are winged personifications. We've talked about these before, these allegorical figures. Winged figures representing the 4 seasons of the year. Each of them dressed differently, each of them nude males. And they are surrounding Oculus, round opening, with probably the buried couple in it. Portrait of them. And certainly the idea of the 4 seasons is, again, a sense of cyclical, right? Things return on themselves. That after the winter there is the spring, right? That things that seem dead aren't dead, but it's all part of a cycle of rejuvenation. And that idea of a cycle of rejuvenation is reiterated because around the circle with the buried couple, we have zodiac signs. Right? And they too relate to the cycle of the year, as does this circular form that we're seeing. Right? So again, even though Junius Bassus's sarcophagus takes on Christian elements, and others do as well, not everyone does immediately, now that Christianity is the name of the game. Right? So I think this is our last work for today. Not every Christian could afford a fancy sarcophagus, as you might imagine. Right? The last scene of The Big Lebowski. They're going to go get the ashes at the end. And they say, oh, they take it out in a coffee can because they don't want to spend for a fancy purpose. Right? Not every Christian can afford a fancy sarcophagus. Some of them were buried in the catacombs, which were underground passages designed specifically for burial and outside of the main city gates of Rome. Now, they're probably still aristocrats. After all, these are decorated. But they're not this sort of, what do you want to call them, the one percenters like Julius Bassus. Right? So aristocratic burials, not as wealthy as some, and buried outside of the city of Rome. The catacombs were eventually used for worship as well, but their original design was to be used as burial sites exclusively. The only religious service that would be performed inside the catacombs was the rite of burial, right? The ritual and the services that were attended the actual burial ceremony. Now, later that changed. Later, people began to take refuge down here during later periods of persecution. But this is not the original design. This is fresco. We haven't really talked a lot about fresco yet. And as if I anticipated your question. And by the way, there's those real skulls, right? Fresco, the term fresco comes from, it's the same thing the Romans were using all along, okay? When we talked about first style Roman wall painting, second style, fourth style, all of those were fresco. And what it is plaster that's placed over the building material. In this case, it's the dirt of the earth that they'd excavated. In other cases, it was that ugly Roman concrete, right? So you put wet plaster over that, and then before the plaster dries, you paint it. And what happens in that particular chemical process is that it forms a bond. Not only does it sink into the wet plaster, but actually it forms a sort of crystalline bond that's really durable. Okay? And you've got to live in an area where it will dry before it rots. So that's why we see a lot more of it in Italy than we do elsewhere in Europe with fresco. And the term fresco is just the Latin term for fresh. Okay? Fresco. This is what we say, dining al fresco. Right? It doesn't mean you're dining in paint. It means you're dining in the fresh air outside. So fresco just means fresh. And the whole idea is that to paint it, you paint into the wet plaster, the fresh plaster before it dries. Right? And it remains a sort of staple, one of the major staples of Italian architectural decoration through most of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The Sistine ceiling is a fresco. Michelangelo Sistine ceiling is a fresco. So this is decorated in fresco, paint in the wet plaster. This has been the Roman tradition. But I want to compare it back to the fourth style of Roman wall painting. So we're looking at this down in the lower right corner here. Does this look the same? How is it different? Not as what? Not as muscular, right? Doesn't have that same sort of, he's not beefy, right? He's got more, it's actually just a shadow, Mark. It looks like a beard, but it's actually just a shadow. But I think it points to something that is so, the shading on the figure on the left, remember that's from Pompeii, right? No, but I'm saying the shading of the figure on the left is so graded, right? You have all of these different transitions from light to dark. But with the catacomb painting, you don't. At least not as many, right? You have a a light face and a dark side. And so it ends up looking like he's wearing a beard because it's much more simplified. Right? So not only is the body less burly, but the painting style has also become significantly more simple. This is again that anti-classical style that we were talking about. We talked about with sculpture, but too with painting. And in addition to being more simply modeled in 3 dimensions, less muscular, you'll notice that he also does not have that perfect set of proportions. His hands are overly large. There's not much in the way of a sense of setting in the figure. The Pompey figure even casts a shadow, right? There's a there, right? There's a place for him. Here, he just stands on the edge of that circle that he's encompassed in. Right? So we're seeing again this anti-classical style that we've seen in other elements as well. Again, like we talked about, this is a choice on the part of the artist. The anti-classical style is their choice. It's a spiritual kind of painting. Yeah.
Does it matter if you do another guy? Make it that part of it.
Did you play the 10 and R6? You were supposed to have done that before the last exam. Yes, it matters that he's nude. He's a mythological figure, and that's all explained. It certainly matters that the other one isn't nude because he's not a mythological figure. He's probably meant to be one of the aristocrats praying for the deceased. Right. We're a bit ahead of ourselves. That's the pose they used for praying in the early Christian era. It's called the Orant pose, O-R-A-M-T. That's about 5 slides down the pike, right? The Orant pose. Okay? So, remember that the style is a choice. On one hand, it, I think, points us toward the idea of a spiritual truth rather than a celebration of the physical world. This goes back, Mary, to your question about the nudity of the one, right? That's a celebration of the physicality of that figure. The other one is much more ethereal, much more flat, much less three-dimensional, much less physical. But also it helps it to be easily read. The fact that there's no background behind him, he's isolated against the white ground, means that it's much more easy for it to visually communicate. Gets its ideas across simply and directly. Now you'll notice that the ceiling is decorated with circles and semicircles. Again, this goes to the idea of cycles of life, death and resurrection. But it also points back to older Roman traditions, because the Romans had always used round buildings for mausoleums. That was the Roman norm. Burial buildings were round. So our early Christians are simply picking up on that tradition. Who's here in the center? We got a couple minutes left. I'm not done early this time. We see an image of a shepherd. He's carrying a sheep on his shoulders. He has the rest of his flock peacefully around his feet. And you can see from looking that the plants are all just as simply drawn as the human figure is. Again, that simplified anti-classical style. This is an image of the Good Shepherd. And it derives from ancient Greek images that were also known in Rome, but they're translated into Christian purposes. Christ is the Good Shepherd who tends to his flock, who doesn't forget any of us. If you're the lamb that strays away, he'll go find you. Right? This again makes a very good image for a burial site. A reminder of the faithfulness of God at a moment when you might well have doubt. It's a supportive image. Now we'll wrap up early Christian. We're almost done. On Monday, we'll get into Byzantine art on Monday as well, and we'll talk about the exam once I have them all in. Okay? Have a good weekend, and we'll see you soon.